The fog hadn't lifted yet when Maren Kessler walked out to the east field, boots soaked through by 7 in the morning. She stopped at the fence line and just looked at it for a moment. Clover. Thick, dense, impossibly green clover, stretching across 4 acres that had been cracked dirt and thistle 2 summers ago. Bees moved low over the blossoms in that lazy, contented way. Bees only move when there's more food than they know what to do with. Dew sat fat on every leaf, catching the early light like the whole field had been polished overnight. Behind her, past the fence, the rest of the farm told a different story. Pale, tired ground. A few rows of stunted corn from last season still flattened into the dirt, the kind of land that looked like it had given up asking for anything and just accepted whatever came. But not here, not this 4 acres. This was the best thing growing on the Kessler farm in years, and everyone who drove past on Route 9 knew it. People slowed their trucks to look. A few had even pulled over. Maren climbed onto the old Massey Ferguson, the one with the cracked seat cushion her father used to complain about, and turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, and settled into its usual rattle. She lowered the disc harrow behind it, checked the hitch pin twice out of habit, and eased the tractor forward into the clover. The blades bit in. Green folded under. Stems that had taken all spring to grow disappeared into brown earth in seconds. A truck slowed on the road. The driver, an older man named Russ Talbot who'd farmed the next property over for 30 years, leaned out his window. "Maren, you're plowing that under?" She throttled down just enough to be heard. "Yes, sir. That's the healthiest stand of clover I've seen all year, and you're burying it? That's the plan." Russ shook his head slowly, the way people do when they've decided something is none of their business but they're going to say one more thing anyway. "Your granddad would have had a fit." He drove on. Maren watched him go, then looked down at the strip of soil already turned behind her, dark and damp and smelling like rain that hadn't fallen yet. She didn't have a good answer for him, not one that would fit through a truck window anyway, because what she was doing looked, to everyone watching, like destroying the one good thing this farm had managed to grow. What none of them understood yet, what she was only beginning to understand herself, was that she wasn't destroying anything. She was making a deposit. If stories about people who see something everyone else misses keep you watching until the end, go ahead and subscribe and tap that like button now. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We always love seeing how far these stories travel. A year and a half earlier, nobody would have guessed Maren Kessler would end up running 200 acres by herself at 17. Her father, Dale Kessler, had farmed this land his whole life, the way his father had before him. But a torn-up shoulder from a grain auger accident, followed by 2 surgeries that didn't take the way the doctors hoped, ended his farming days faster than anyone expected. He could still walk the fields. He couldn't lift, couldn't wrestle machinery, couldn't put in the 16-hour days that row crop farming demanded. Maren's mother worked full-time at the county hospital, 40 minutes away, and there was no version of the family's finances that let her quit. That left Maren, a junior in high school, with a driver's license she'd had for exactly 8 months, as the only person left standing between the farm and the bank. She didn't romanticize it. There was no music video moment where she decided to become a farmer. She simply woke up one Tuesday morning, realized someone needed to check on the cattle and nobody else was going to, and did it. The land itself made the job harder than it needed to be. For 2 decades, the Kessler farm had been worked the same way most farms in the area were worked. Corn, then soybeans, then corn again. Every year, the same fields turned over every fall whether they needed it or not. It had been productive once, but productive land, worked that way long enough, starts quietly withdrawing from the deal. By the time Maren took it over, the signs were everywhere if you knew where to look, and even if you didn't. Water sat on the surface after rain instead of soaking in. In dry weeks, the ground cracked into plates you could lift with your hand. The topsoil that used to be black and heavy now crumbled pale and thin, more dust than dirt. In places, nothing grew at all. Bare, dust-blown patches the size of a truck bed, where even the weeds had given up. Corn came up patchy. Yields had been sliding for 3 straight years before her father even got hurt. "It's tired ground," he told her once, sitting on the porch with his bad shoulder wrapped in ice. "We ran it hard for a long time. Your grandfather did too. Never really gave it a season off." Maren didn't fully understand what that meant yet. She just knew the numbers on the yield reports kept getting smaller, and the fertilizer bills kept getting bigger, and eventually those 2 lines were going to cross in a direction the farm couldn't survive. One person doubted her more than anyone else, her Uncle Grant, her father's older brother, who farmed the property 2 miles down and had strong opinions about how things should be done. Grant wasn't cruel about it. He genuinely believed a 17-year-old girl had no business making decisions about 200 acres, and he said so often, at Sunday dinners and roadside conversations and anywhere else the topic came up. "You need to plant what sells, Maren," he told her that spring, standing at the edge of the barnyard with his arms crossed. "Corn, beans, that's what pays the note. You can't afford to be experimenting." She didn't argue with him, she just nodded and kept thinking. It started with an old issue of a farm extension newsletter she found in a drawer in her father's office, wedged behind unpaid invoices and a broken stapler. The newsletter was 11 years old. Most of it was outdated, but one article, about half a page long, had been circled in pencil. Her grandfather's handwriting, she was fairly sure, though she couldn't be certain. The article talked about resting ground between cash crops, not leaving it empty, planting something on it that wouldn't be harvested at all, something whose entire job was to be grown and then returned to the earth. She didn't understand most of the technical language, but one sentence stuck with her: "The crop you don't sell can be the one that saves the crop you do." She asked around. Most people her age would have looked it up and moved on. Maren drove out to see Walt Pruitt, a retired soil conservation officer who lived alone on a small property outside town and who her father had mentioned once, years ago, in passing. Walt was suspicious of her at first. A teenager showing up asking about cover crops wasn't something that happened often, but he warmed up once he realized she was actually listening. "Clover," he told her, sitting on an overturned bucket in his shed, "isn't really about the clover. It's about what's happening where you can't see it." He didn't explain everything. He seemed to enjoy leaving some of it unsaid, like a teacher who wanted a student to find the rest herself. But he told her enough to make her curious, and curious enough to act. That spring, instead of putting the whole east field into corn like her uncle expected, Maren seeded 4 acres of it in clover. Nobody understood the decision. Her uncle certainly didn't. "You're going to plant something you can't sell?" Grant asked, standing at the fence with an expression that mixed confusion and something close to alarm. "Maren, we need income off that ground, not a green lawn." "It's not forever," she said. "It's one season." One season you can't afford to waste. She didn't have a confident answer for him. She wasn't fully sure herself what she was doing, or whether it would work. But something about that circled sentence in her grandfather's handwriting had planted itself in her the same way the clover seed was about to plant itself in the ground. The clover came up faster than anything else on the farm ever had. By early June, the 4 acres looked like nothing else on the property. Nothing else in the county, really. Thick, low, tangled green, spotted white and pink with blossoms, humming constantly with bees and other pollinators that seemed to appear from nowhere. Where the rest of the farm baked pale under the summer sun, this patch stayed cool and dark and damp underneath, holding moisture the surrounding fields simply let go of. People noticed. A woman from the co-op stopped by to ask if Maren was starting a pollinator program. A neighbor 2 farms over asked, half joking, if she was going into the honey business. Someone suggested she should bale it for hay and sell it. Clover hay wasn't worthless, after all, and it seemed like a shame to let a stand that healthy go to waste. Maren gave polite, non-committal answers to all of it. She wasn't planning to harvest the clover. She wasn't planning to sell it. What she was actually planning to do with it, she kept mostly to herself, partly because she wasn't fully sure how to explain it yet. Because the truth was, she wasn't looking at the clover the way everyone else was. While the neighbors admired the flowers and the bees, Maren spent her evenings kneeling in the dirt underneath it, digging small handfuls of soil and rubbing them between her fingers, checking something no one else seemed to be paying attention to at all. She was watching the roots. And whatever she was seeing down there, it was enough to keep her from cutting a single stem of that clover for hay, no matter how many people suggested it. If she wasn't going to sell it, and she wasn't going to feed it to cattle, and she wasn't going to let it go to seed for next year, what, exactly, was she planning to do with the best-looking crop on the whole farm? By late June, the clover was at its peak. Neighbors driving past slowed down out of habit now, expecting to see it there, thick and blooming and impossibly out of place against the rest of the land. That was the week Maren started the tractor. She'd told her mother the night before, at the kitchen table, in a voice that sounded more certain than she actually felt. "I'm going to disc the clover under this weekend." Her mother frowned. "Under? You mean plow it into the ground?" "That's the idea." "Maren, That's the best crop on this farm. People keep asking about it. I know. Her mother didn't argue further. She'd learned, over the past 2 years, that arguing with Maren rarely changed anything, and sometimes it was better to trust her and see what happened. Not everyone extended the same trust. Word travels fast in farm country, and by the time Maren actually lowered the disc harrow into the clover that Saturday morning, there was an audience. Russ Talbot slowed his truck at the fence. A couple of kids from the next farm over stopped their bikes on the road. Someone even took a photo. The disc blades cut through the clover in wide, even strips, folding green growth under brown soil, turning 4 acres of the healthiest thing on the farm into what looked, from the road, like nothing at all. Russ was the one who finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Why would you grow the best thing on this farm just to bury it? Maren throttled the tractor down and thought about how to answer. What came out wasn't a full explanation. She still didn't have one, not completely, but it was honest. I'm not burying it, she said. I'm putting it where the farm actually needs it. Russ raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, and drove on without another word. She sat there a moment longer, engine idling, looking at the dark strip of turned earth behind her, still not entirely sure herself if she was doing the right thing. The story moved through the community faster than Maren expected. At the feed store, a man she barely knew asked her, only half joking, if she was trying to grow weeds on purpose. 2 other men near the register laughed at that, openly, one of them loud enough that a few heads turned. Best crop on the place, he said, still chuckling, and she plowed it into the dirt. He wasn't being cruel exactly. He just couldn't imagine a reason good enough to make sense of it, and laughing was easier than asking. At church, an older woman patted her hand and told her, kindly but firmly, that farming wasn't something you could learn from books, and maybe she should let her uncle take over the decisions for a while. Grant didn't say much the week the clover went under. He didn't have to. His silence, and the occasional look he gave the flattened field when he drove past, said enough. At night, alone in her room with the yield reports and the seed catalogs spread across her bed, Maren let herself wonder if everyone was right. What if Walt had been wrong? What if the article her grandfather circled was outdated, disproven, irrelevant to ground this exhausted? She'd spent money on clover seed the farm couldn't easily spare, given up 4 acres of cash crop income for an entire season, and had nothing to show for it but a strip of bare dirt and a town full of people who thought she'd made a foolish decision. She thought about her father, still healing, still unable to do the physical work he used to do without thinking twice. She thought about the loan payment due at the end of summer. She thought about how much easier this would all be if she'd simply planted corn like everyone expected and kept her head down. But she also thought about the roots she'd pulled up from underneath that clover. Pale, branching, threaded deep into soil that used to be too hard to push a shovel into. Something had been happening under there. She was almost sure of it. Almost wasn't the same as certain. And certain was what she needed, with the growing season only getting shorter. July brought a dry spell no one in the area had seen in years. 3 weeks without rain turned into 5. The corn on Grant's farm, and on most of the farms along Route 9, began to curl and yellow under the relentless sun. Irrigation costs climbed. Someone 2 farms over lost nearly 1/3 of their soybean crop before the county even finished tallying the damage. Maren watched the same dry heat settle over her own land and braced for the worst. If the clover experiment had failed, if Walt's advice had been wrong, if the article had been outdated, this was exactly the kind of stress that would expose it. Then, in early August, the rain finally came. Not gently, it arrived all at once, over 4 inches in a single night, the kind of storm that usually meant flooded ditches and washed-out gravel roads by morning. The next day, Maren walked her fields to check the damage, expecting the worst. Most of the farm had taken it hard. Water sat in the low spots of the untreated ground, pooled and stagnant, unable to soak in fast enough. A section of the north field had visible erosion, a thin brown scar cut down the slope where topsoil had simply washed away in the night. But the 4 acres where the clover had gone under looked different. The water had gone somewhere, not sitting on top, not running off, gone, down, into ground that seemed to have simply absorbed it. Maren knelt at the edge of that 4-acre section the way she had all summer, but this time what she found under her fingers made her stop. The soil wasn't just damp. It was dark, almost black, and it crumbled apart in loose, soft clumps instead of the hard, dusty pieces she was used to. When she dug deeper, she found earthworms, more than she remembered ever seeing on this farm before, threading through soil that pulled apart easily instead of resisting the shovel the way it always had. She walked 20 feet over, past the edge of the old clover ground, into soil that hadn't been treated the same way, and dug again, pale, compacted, dry just an inch below the wet surface. No worms, no give. The difference wasn't subtle. It was the difference between two entirely different farms occupying the same 20 feet of ground. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, walking the rest of the property that week, she found a complication that kept her from celebrating too soon. A narrow strip along the edge of the clover section, where the ground dipped slightly, hadn't improved the same way. Still hard, still resistant, water still sitting instead of soaking through. It wasn't a failure, but it wasn't the clean, complete success she'd hoped to find either. It was a reminder that she still didn't fully understand what she was doing, and that the ground didn't respond the same way in every square foot. That uncertainty came at the worst possible time. The farm's loan payment loomed that fall, and the numbers weren't cooperating. Repairs on the old grain bin, a vet bill for 2 sick calves, and a season of reduced planted acreage had left less cushion than Maren wanted to admit, even to her mother. She was starting to prove something to herself about the soil. Whether the farm could survive long enough for that proof to matter was still an open question. It was Walt who finally laid it out plainly, sitting again on his overturned bucket while Maren described what she'd found. Clover roots pull nitrogen out of the air, he told her, with a little help from bacteria that live right there on the roots. Rhizobia, they're called. Most plants can't do that. They have to pull nitrogen out of the soil, and after enough seasons of the same crops doing the same pulling, there's less and less left to pull. He picked up a handful of dry dirt from a coffee can on his shelf and let it run through his fingers. Think of your soil like a bank account. Corn and beans planted the same way year after year keep making withdrawals. Clover's one of the only things that makes a deposit instead. It pulls nitrogen from the air, holds it in its roots, and when you turn that whole plant under, all of it, the nitrogen, the organic matter, everything, goes back into the ground for the next crop to use. And the water? Maren asked. That's the roots too, mostly. All those channels the clover roots leave behind, once they break down, they don't disappear. They leave the soil looser, full of little tunnels and air pockets. Water soaks in instead of running off. Worms move in because there's more organic matter to feed on, and they loosen things up even more. One good season of clover won't fix ground that's been run hard for 20 years, but it starts the account moving in the right direction instead of the wrong one." End quote. It wasn't instant, but for the first time, Maren had a full picture of what she'd actually done, not guessed at, not half understood from a pencil circle in an old newsletter, but explained, plainly, by someone who'd spent a career watching soil behave exactly this way. That September, with the loan payment covered by a smaller than usual but still real corn harvest from the rest of the farm, Maren planted winter wheat into the 4 acres where the clover had gone under. The difference showed almost immediately. Germination came faster and more evenly than anywhere else on the property. The seedlings pushed up thick and dark green, roots finding loose, welcoming soil instead of fighting through hardpan. By the time the wheat was ankle high, the contrast with the rest of the farm was impossible to miss, even for people who'd barely glanced at the property all summer. Where the conventionally worked ground showed the usual mix of thin patches and stressed plants, the former clover ground looked uniform, dense, almost unreasonably healthy. Birds worked the rows for insects. The ground held moisture noticeably longer after each rain. When Maren dug a shovel in to check root depth, it slid through easily, the way it hadn't anywhere else on the farm in years. When the wheat came in the following summer, Maren kept careful records, something she'd started doing out of necessity, since nobody else on the farm was tracking it the way she wanted. The 4 acres that had carried clover the year before yielded noticeably higher than the surrounding ground planted the conventional way, enough of a difference that it wasn't explainable by luck or weather alone. The soil samples Walt helped her send off for testing came back showing real, measurable increases in organic matter compared to a sample taken from the untreated section nearby. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't a complete transformation of a struggling farm into a perfect one, but it was proof, in numbers nobody could wave away, that the ground she'd built up with clover was doing more with less fertilizer, less water, less stress, than the ground that had been worked the old way. Grant showed up at the fence line that fall. the same spot where he'd questioned her decision more than a year earlier. He didn't apologize. That wasn't really his way. He stood there for a while, looking at the wheat stubble on ground that used to be some of the worst on the farm, and finally asked the question instead. "How'd you get it to do that?" Maren told him, not with pride, just plainly. The clover, the roots, the nitrogen, the way the ground had learned to hold water differently once it had something besides corn and beans running through it year after year. Grant listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was for him its own kind of admission. "Might try a strip of it myself next spring," he said eventually, and that was as close to approval as Maren was ever going to get from him. It was enough. That October, Maren walked out to the same 4 acres at sunset, the way she had that first foggy morning over a year before, when the clover had stood tall and green and about to be plowed under while half the county watched and wondered what she was thinking. The field looked different now, not dramatic, not like something out of a movie, just quietly, steadily healthier than it used to be. Wheat stubble gave way to soil that held together instead of crumbling to dust. The ground didn't crack the way it once had in August. Water didn't sit on the surface after a hard rain anymore. She thought about that morning on the tractor, the neighbors slowing their trucks, the certainty in everyone's voice that she was making a mistake. None of them had been able to see what she'd been building. Not because it was hidden on purpose, but because it was happening in the one place people never think to look, beneath their feet, in the part of the farm that doesn't show up in a photograph or a drive-by glance. She understood something now that she hadn't fully grasped the day she lowered that disc harrow into the clover. Some of the most important work on a farm doesn't show results right away, and doesn't look like progress while it's happening. Sometimes it looks like giving something up. Sometimes it looks like failure, right up until the season it doesn't. The farm hadn't come alive by accident, and it hadn't come alive all at once. It had come alive one deposit at a time, in ground that finally had something worth growing into. Some harvests, Maren had learned, you can't see coming. You just have to trust the roots are doing their work, long before the rest of the world notices anything has changed at all.